будет выступать профессор Лоренцини, ассоциированный профессор Университета Пенсильвании, с темой Post-Truth Democracy in Parrhēsia. И во многом она связана с недавно вышедшей в 2023 году в Университете Чикаго книгой The Force of Truth. Вот в целом и все. So, Professor Lorenzini, you can start.
Great. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here in these also difficult times to support, I think, the pursuit of knowledge, like in free discussion in the kind of international world that academia allows us to create. So today, I wanted to present some of the arguments that I defend in the book that was cited, The Force of Truth, Critique, Genealogy, and Truth-Telling in Michel Foucault, and that was published a few months ago. And I'm going to talk mostly about Foucault's account of truth and truth-telling. Okay, so does truth have a history? This question still occupies a central place in contemporary philosophical and political debate. Those who give this question a negative answer, so truth does not have a history, usually argue that it is the postmodern thinkers, and among them in particular Michel Foucault, who deserve the most blame for reducing truth to a mere historical accident. Foucault is indeed commonly considered to be one of the main champions of relativism about truth. And due to his enormous influence in virtually all fields of the humanities and social sciences, is regularly accused of being the tutelary father of contemporary devaluation of truth and facts, in other words, of the current post-truth era, with devastating consequences for our democracies. For instance, in his book Post-Truth, Lee McIntyre writes, I quote, "Even if right-wing politicians and other science deniers who are not reading Derrida and Foucault, the germ of the idea made its way to them. Science does not have a monopoly on the truth. It is therefore not unreasonable to think that right-wingers are using some of the same arguments and techniques of postmodernism to attack the truth of other scientific claims that clash with their conservative ideology." End of quote. So we're told by many that we must criticize Foucault, among others, because we must resist this idea that truth is a mere historical epiphenomenon, and what is more, nothing else than a side effect of power relations. This influential, almost unquestioned way of interpreting Foucault dates back to at least the 1980s, when prominent philosophers and political theorists, such as Nancy Fraser, Jürgen Habermas, and Charles Taylor, started criticizing Foucault for claiming that, as Taylor puts it, quote, "There is no truth that can be espoused, defended, or rescued against systems of power, because each such system defines its own variant of truth," end quote. 40 years later, the charge has become even more damning. By disqualifying all claims to objectivity and thereby reducing truth to a historically situated epiphenomenon of power, Foucault effectively removed out from under us all stable ground for drawing a distinction between, as Miranda Fricker puts it, what we have a reason to think and what mere relations of power are doing to our thinking. Now, leaving aside the most sensationalist claims, I think that this line of criticism warrants serious consideration. Indeed, Foucault does argue that there is no vérité du dehors, no truth of the outside, which is to say, no truth external to a series of historically situated games of truth, which establish the rules for obtaining it, and thereby no truth external to a given regime of truth, which determines the obligations of the individual with regard to it. Indeed, one of the main claims of my book is that as soon as we depart from a minimalist understanding of the word truth and start analyzing the concept of truth or the conditions necessary and sufficient for something to count as true or for someone to count as a truth teller, we necessarily enter the realm of history as well as of ethics and politics. We need, in other words, and that's kind of the main meta claim of my book, we need to problematize the idea that the epistemic domain has some sort of privilege that magically grants it a completely independent status vis-a-vis other crucial domains of our experience. The point is that Foucault's project of the history of truth and of truth-telling, by which he really means the genealogy of regimes of truth, I'll come back to this point. So Foucault's project of a history of truth, far from entailing the claim that truth does not exist, draws from Nietzsche in order to problematize the value of truth. There is an intuitive connection between the revelation of the historicity of a given belief, concept of practice and its at least potential devaluation. This is what Amiya Srinivasan aptly calls genealogical anxiety, the worry that historical contingency could undermine the value of our beliefs, concepts, and practices. Unsurprisingly, this worry is particularly acute when it comes to the concept of truth, because knowing the truth about the world, about others, and about oneself is normally construed as intrinsically valuable. Why is that? This, I argue, is the fundamental question that Foucault's history of truth raises and aims to examine. Why do we tend to attribute this kind of intrinsic value and intrinsic force to the truth? This question is clearly inspired by Nietzsche's claims in The Genealogy of Morality. I quote Nietzsche, "From the very moment that faith in the God of the ascetic ideal is denied, there is a new problem as well, that of the value of truth. The will to truth needs a critique. Let us define our task with this. The value of truth must for once be experimentally called into question." End of quote. So what value does truth possess? Far from claiming that it does not possess any and that we must simply do away with it, Nietzsche and Foucault both question the unconditional nature of our will to truth, which is to say the idea that it needs no justification since truth must be conceived as somewhat intrinsically valuable. Foucault, however, in relation to Nietzsche, is original, I think, in approaching this problem of the value of truth through the lens of a distinction that I consider very important, the distinction between games and regimes of truth. So what I want to do today is to address this distinction between games and regimes of truth in the first part of my talk, and then move on to Foucault's analysis of Parrhēsia in the second part. Okay, so games and regimes of truth. In his 1980 lecture course on the government of the living, Foucault defines a regime of truth as that which determines the obligations of individuals with regard to the manifestation of truth. Compared to his prior definitions of this concept, Foucault's definition of regimes of truth in 1980 is premised on a new element which was not explicitly there before. This new element is the subject, the fact that we always have something to do when it comes to the truth. However, by clarifying the distinction between games and regimes of truth, Foucault also provides us here with invaluable tools to respond to one of the most common objections raised against his work, namely that it risks amounting to nothing but a reduction to power. So I'm going to defend this claim now. The new definition of the concept of regime of truth relies on an insight which Foucault warns us we will likely find problematic, for it contradicts a deeply rooted way of thinking about truth and power. The manifestation of truth, Foucault argues, does not take place in a vacuum and at least in practice, can never be perfectly separated from power relations. This does not mean, however, that truth just is power, which is probably one of the main claims that we find always attributed to Foucault, right? Truth is power. Foucault here is very clear in saying truth is not power, right? So there is a way in which he wants to distinguish them. To prove his point, Foucault introduces the notion of truth obligations. The manifestation of truth, he claims, is always accompanied by specific obligations for the subject who is involved in it. But why should we add this notion of obligation to the notion of manifestation of truth? And in what sense does the truth oblige? Foucault asks. If there's an obligation that binds individual to something presented to them as true, and that compels them to recognize and posit it as such, it seems that we are not actually dealing with the truth, or so the objection goes, since the truth obliges only by virtue of its intrinsic force and not an external regime of power. Better still, and this is Foucault kind of formulating this objection, it seems we tend to think that the truth, strictly speaking, never obliges, it never forces us. Obligation and coercion do exist, of course, but only when and insofar as the truth as such is not involved. When something is true, you know, like it doesn't force us, it's just true. This objection challenges the legitimacy of the very concept of regime of truth. If there is obligation, if there is regime, it just means that we are not actually dealing with the truth, but rather with the coercion, the non-truth. In responding to this objection, Foucault explains that it didn't want, and in fact he wanted, to deny that the truth is, he says, index sui, this expression from, what does he mean by that? Means that any game of truth that is in any regulated system for the production of truth claims, that's the definition of what a game of truth is, when this game is considered in terms of formal structure and not the individuals who concretely engage with it. So in any game of truth, only the truth can legitimately show the true and establish distinction between true and false statements. On the other hand, however, Foucault argues that if we consider the regime of truth, thus taking into account the individuals who are concretely engaged in this or that game of truth, we must conclude that the truth is not the creator and holder of the rights it exercises over human beings, of the obligations the latter have towards it, and of the effects they expect from these obligations when and insofar as they are fulfilled. In other words, Foucault claims all reasoning and demonstration entails an assertion which doesn't itself belong to the realm of the true or false. That is, it doesn't pertain to the formal structure of the game of truth, but is rather a sort of commitment, a sort of profession. If it is true, then I will submit. It is true, therefore I submit. So Foucault here really is drawing this distinction, saying there is a multiplicity of games of truth that are defined by a series of rules that can allow us to distinguish true and false statements which within each of these games of truth, you know, science, logic, philosophy, etc. And then there are regimes of truth, which is another perspective that we can take on the games of truth once we put in actual individuals, actual people that play with those games. And the regimes of truth is the perspective that allows us to ask the question, what does it mean for an individual to actually be bound to the truth that they discover or they create when they play a certain game of truth. So even though it is sometimes made imperceptible by a given regime of truth, even though it goes without saying in many ways, this therefore, in the claim, it is true, therefore I submit, is what, according to Foucault, gives binding force to the truth. So what Foucault is trying to say here is that the truth doesn't have any intrinsic binding force. It is something, this binding force of the truth is something that is added to it. Indeed, this you have to of the truth cannot be justified or accounted for in terms of the game of truth. It is, Foucault claims, a historical cultural problem that can only be addressed in terms of the regime of truth. The task that Foucault attributes to this genealogy of the regimes of truth is precisely that of revealing, of making us see the often imperceptible therefore on which they lie. Let's take a moment to further unpack Foucault's argument. Foucault's point here is that every game of truth possesses a logic and structure which, in a sense, establish this truth falsity, provided that we consider it from the standpoint internal to the game of truth itself, thus bracketing the social, political, and historical context, provided, in short, do not address it as a regime. The autonomy of the formal rules which establish the distinction true and falsity within a given game of truth has only a partial autonomy. It depends, as I just mentioned, in 1980, Foucault argues that the truth is index sui because every game of explicitly or implicitly defines settles which within that game make possible to establish the distinction between truth and falsity without the need to refer to anything else, to any additional rule external to the game. However, as we adopt the perspective of the truth in which the game of truth, is a part, we inevitably realize these rules are not supra-historical or universal, and that they do not derive their justification or their force from the truth they establish. This is what Foucault means when he claims that the therefore that links the is true to the I submit is a historical, cultural, and ultimately ethico-political problem that can only be addressed at the level of the truth. In my book, I suggest that we can construe this distinction between games and regimes of truth as a distinction between what I call the epistemic acceptance of a given truth claims, on the one hand, and the practical submission to that claim on the other. While acceptance of the truth can be explained at the level of the game of truth, that is, by relying on its formal structure and rules, submission to the truth, giving the truth the right and power to govern one's and others' conduct, must be addressed at a different level, the level of the regime of truth. This distinction that Foucault draws between the notions of game and regime of truth has virtually gone unnoticed in the literature, but I think it's crucial for many reasons, not least that it constitutes the clearest possible rebuttal to the commonplace criticism according to which Foucault's history of truth rely on an illegitimate reduction of truth power. By contrast, as I just said, Foucault explicitly acknowledges that every game of truth possesses an internal logic and a formal structure which, in a sense, autonomously establish the distinction between truth and falsity. Truth and power are therefore clearly distinct from one another on that level of analysis. Foucault doesn't want to just say, truth is power, that's it. Yet, this is only part of the story, for Foucault aims to problematize this autonomy, albeit from a different perspective, the perspective of the regime of truth, which reveals the complex interaction between truth and power within the procedures that are used to govern human beings. Thus, while Foucault draws a clear distinction between games and regimes of truth, one which allows him to avoid reductionism, it's crucial to emphasize that his history of truth aims to show that there is no actual game of truth without or external to a regime of truth. This means that concretely, no game of truth has the privilege of being pure and entirely autonomous. On the contrary, every game of truth is part of a broader regime of truth which determines the obligations of the individuals who are engaged in it and who utter the therefore that links state is true to the I submit. This therefore is the crucial element on which the government of human beings by the truth ultimately relies. It is the allegedly free commitment through which the subject gives the governmental mechanisms of power the authority to conduct or conduct. For instance, let's take an example. The contemporary medical and psychiatric game of truth defines the condition of gender dysphoria as the distress resulting from the incongruence between experience or express gender and one's identity. So in symptoms, at the end of which, according to the criteria laid out in the DSM-5, it turns out that I do suffer from the condition of gender dysphoria. The rules of the game of truth allow us, me and my doctor, to reach the conclusion that I am gender dysphoric. This truth, which within the contemporary medical and psychiatric game of truth is index sui, in the sense that it is what defines the difference between truth and falsity, nevertheless entails a series of major consequences in terms of the conduct of my conduct. If it's true that I am gender dysphoric, then I must be medically treated for this condition. Foucault's point is that my submission to this further claim, I suffer from X, therefore I must be medically treated. So this kind of further claim that entails this, therefore I must do X, can be explained, according to Foucault, at the level of the game of truth. Cannot just be explained on the basis of a truth that we established within a game, but has to be addressed and problematized at the level of the regime of truth, which focuses on the obligations that derive from the truth claim established within the game of truth. Now, as this example shows, the ethico-political relevance of the therefore that links that it is true to the I submit can hardly be overstated. By focusing precisely on that therefore, on the element which connects the game of truth and power and its effect in terms, saying without or external to a regime of truth, because every game of truth, when played by flesh and blood individuals, entails a process of subject constitution, which relies on the acceptable or refusal by the individual of the you have of the truth. Hence, in 1980, the complex dynamics of subjection and subjectivation are situated at the very core of Foucault's history of truth, thus adding an explicitly ethico-political dimension to it. In my reading, this is what opens to Foucault in the final years of his life the conceptual possibility of elaborating an ethics and politics of truth-telling. I now turn, for the second last part of my talk, to this project. From what I just said, it's clear that Foucault's history of truth must also ask the question of who can and actually does utter statements that can count as true, in what circumstances, and at what cost. In recent years, Foucault's analysis of different historical forms of truth-telling, from ancient Parrhēsia and Christian confession to juridical avowal and psychoanalytic discourse, have attracted growing attention in the scholarly literature. What is still lacking, however, is an account that situates them systematically within the broader context of his project of history of truth. And this is precisely this link is one of the main aims of my book, since I'm convinced that if we want to rethink the role of critique today in our society, we have to ask questions such as, under what conditions is telling the truth an effective critical activity? And does the critical aspect of the practice of truth-telling exclusively depend on the revelation of the truth? If you understand truth as synonymous with evidence or facts, the answer to this last question is clearly negative. Indeed, too many examples show that the accumulation of evidence and facts is, unfortunately, I would say, like I'm not happy about this, but I think it's a fact that just accumulating facts and truth is not enough to disrupt a certain status quo or to convince everyone. Donald Trump's fact-checking score is usually abysmal, but people still vote for him. Is not in itself a critical force in the political domain. It can be, but in order to explain why and when truth is a critical force, we need something more than an epistemic analysis of the truth. The individual's practical submission to a given statement is not an automatic consequence of the statement's truth value. This, of course, does not mean that we should ignore facts nor avoid talking about truth in the political and ethical spheres. It instead means, or so I argue, that we do need to elaborate an ethics and politics of truth-telling that doesn't just situate itself on the epistemic level, and that asks instead the question of the force of truth. When does the truth acquire force in the ethical and political domain? In my book, I address this question through an analysis of Parrhēsia that focuses on its perlocutory dimensions. And in doing so, I draw from Foucault, but also from J.L. Austin and Stanley Cavell. I will not have the time today to go into this, but if you want, if you're interested, we can talk more about it in the Q&A. So I'll try to be very brief and very schematic here in the interest of time. As you know, one of Austin's main insights is that to perform a locutionary act, like to say something meaningful, also means in general to perform an illocutionary act, such as asking or answering a question, giving information or assurance, announcing an intention or a verdict, and so on. Moreover, Austin claims there's a further sense in which to perform a locutionary act and therein an illocutionary act may also be to perform another kind of act, namely a perlocutionary act. Saying something, Austin claims, quote, will often or even normally produce certain consequential effects upon the feelings, thoughts, or actions of the audience or of the speakers or of other persons. And it might be done with the design, intention, or purpose of producing them, end of quote. My idea that I defend in the book is that it's useful, it's helpful to approach Parrhēsia from this perspective of the perlocutionary. Indeed, what is Parrhēsia according to Foucault? Foucault usually doesn't give many definitions, but it does give a definition of Parrhēsia in his lectures, Discourse and Truth, and where he defines Parrhēsia as follows. It is a certain, so I'm quoting Foucault, it is a certain verbal activity in which the speaker has a specific relation to truth through frankness, a certain relation to herself through danger, a certain relation to law through freedom and duty, and a certain relation to other people through critique, self-critique, or critique of other people. End of quote. To define Parrhēsia, in other words, Foucault suggests that we should not focus the internal structure of the discourse or the aim which the true discourse seeks to achieve vis-a-vis the interlocutor, but rather on the speaker and the risk that truth-telling opens up for them. Parrhēsia is for Foucault a specific verbal activity which binds the speaker to the fact that what he says is the truth and to the consequences which follow from the fact that he has told the truth. Consequences that I construe in terms of perlocutionary effects, thus developing a perlocutionary analysis of parrhēsia as a speech act that takes the form of a list of conditions of parrhēsiastic utterance. I'm going to be very schematic here, again, limiting myself to presenting the conclusions of my argument. So in my analysis of parrhēsia as a speech act, I list seven necessary conditions for an utterance to count as a parrhēsiastic utterance. The first condition is the unpredictability of the effects of the utterance. The second is what I call the freedom of the speaker. The third is the criticism of the interlocutor. The fourth is the risk that the speaker takes. The fifth is the courage that they show. The sixth is the transparency of the utterance. And the seventh is the kind of truth condition that I call alethurgy, which is the word that Foucault uses to name the manifestation or the eruption of the truth. So just to go through these conditions quickly. The idea behind condition one is that whereas in a performative utterance, the given elements of the situation are such that when the utterance is made, the effect which follows is known and codified in advance. In parrhēsia, by contrast, what makes an utterance parrhēsiastic is that the eruption of a true discourse that determines, Foucault writes, an open situation, or rather opens the situation and makes possible effects which are not known in advance. Consequently, these effects belong to the domain of the perlocutionary. They are real effects as opposed to the conventional consequences that belong to the illocutionary domain. From this first condition stems another difference that Foucault emphasizes between parrhēsia and performative utterance. In order for a performative utterance to be felicitous, and thus for its illocutionary consequences to be realized, the institutional status, social position of the speaker is crucial because the person speaking must have the status which permits her to carry out what is stated by the utterance. So this is a very simple idea that Austin defends. In order to be able to forgive someone by saying, I forgive you, one must have suffered an offense from that specific person. Doesn't really make sense that I tell someone I forgive you if they didn't do anything to me, right? By contrast, parrhēsiastic utterance is characterized by the fact that the parrhēsiast is someone who emphasizes own freedom as an individual speaking, which is condition 2 of my list. So there is this idea of freedom that is built into the concept of parrhēsia itself. Condition 3 is quite straightforward. It's just the criticism condition. The fact that the statement must be intentionally uttered in front of or addressed to someone who has a reason to feel questioned by it in its way of thinking and being. And this entails the conditions of risk and courage, fourth and fifth. Indeed, Foucault is adamant that parrhēsia always takes place in circumstances such that it will, may, or must entail costly consequences for the speaker. It characterizes this condition of parrhēsiastic utterance in terms of the opening of a space of unspecified risk for the speaker, which also entails that at the heart of parrhēsia, Foucault argues, don't find the speaker's institutional social status, but their courage. One has to show some form of courage in order to take that risk. Condition 6 has to do with the idea that parrhēsia aims to convey the thought purely and simply with the minimum embellishment compatible with this transparency. This is a tricky condition. The relationship between parrhesia and rhetoric is a complex one. If you're interested, we can come back to this in the Q&A. But in the interest of time, I'll move on to condition 7, which I call alethargy. Indeed, according to Foucault, the main function of parrhesia is to express or manifest the speaker's relation to the truth, where truth should here be conceived not in epistemic terms, but as an ethical political force. Indeed, the truth manifested by the parrhesias should not be assessed in light of their truth value, of the truth value of their statements, even though the latter can also be true from a constitutive logical or epistemological perspective. For instance, that's an example that Foucault uses. It was not the truth value of Galileo's claim, according to which the earth revolves around the sun, that made his utterance a parrhesiastic one. Galileo was a parrhesiast, according to Foucault, because of the risk he took by courageously making his views public, even when knowing the Catholic Church would deem them to be heretic. In many other cases, however, the parrhesia statements cannot even be attributed a truth value. Think of Pericles in front of the Athenian assembly, claiming that we should not yield to the Peloponnesian, or of Plato in front of the tyrant of Syracuse, claiming that tyrants are not courageous. These claims are claims in the moral sphere which cannot even be attributed a straightforward truth value. These are indeed what Foucault calls ethical and political truth. However, politics and ethics are not the only fields in which parrhesia takes place. Scientific, historical, or literary alethargies, for example, can all be considered instances of parrhesia in the appropriate circumstances. In short, Foucault's point is that no matter the field, what is at stake in parrhesia are the ethical and political dimensions of the practice of truth-telling. Parrhesiastic utterance is a manifestation of truth because it expresses and reinforces the harmony between the speaker's thoughts, words, and deeds, while at the same time criticizing the beliefs and the conduct of the interlocutor, and thus courageously opening up a space for risk or speak. In this sense, a parrhesia is not just borrowing from psychiatric power. This mode of truth should rather be conceived as an event. It is, we could say, a truth thunderbolt, which establishes a relationship not of knowledge connaissance, but of shock or clash between the speaker and her interlocutors. This is why parrhesiastic alethargy can only take place in the encounter between two or more individuals and never in the solitary, intimate experience of the discovery of an inner truth. Now, let me conclude briefly. I hope that my book and the arguments I've presented today, drawing from it, can help shift the focus of scholars away from the worn-out discussion about Foucault, postmodernism, and post-truth. Rethinking the current relation between critique, truth, and truth-telling is a delicate and, I think, politically urgent task. Indeed, the proliferation of lies, fake news, and alternative facts on social media and other news outlets presents us with an uncomfortable dilemma. Either we concede that truth does not really matter, since everything just depends on power, propaganda, persuasion, or we defend the political, ethical, social value of truth, especially of scientific truth. While the choice is clear for most of us in this alternative, the uncomfortable part of this task comes with the temptation to think that in order to defend the value of truth, one has to construe it as intrinsic or unconditional. Critical thinkers such as Nietzsche and Foucault therefore immediately become suspect. In our post-truth era, we are told we should not be allowed to problematize the value of truth or to elaborate a critique of the will to truth. It's too dangerous, right? Any project of this sort is a dangerous way of giving in to relativism, science denialism, and alternative facts. However, this conclusion does not take into account that truth and facts alone, as I tried to show, truth and facts alone do not possess any intrinsic critical force. Truth and facts alone are often not enough to sustain effective critical practices, since they have no critical force in and of themselves, as so many examples around us clearly show. As a consequence, Foucault's analysis of truth and truth-telling, correctly understood, seem to be of utter importance today. As we saw, Foucault incessantly raises the question of truth, of its value, and of its ethico-political effects, thus inciting us to ask the crucial question of the conditions under which telling the truth can be an effective critical practice, and what it actually means to speak the truth at an ethical, social, and political level. What Foucault puts at the core of his critical project, more precisely, is what I've called the therefore of truth. This kind of often imperceptible procedure which leads us not only to accept certain truth claims, but to submit to them and give them the power to govern our conduct. This is what I've called the problem of the force of truth. Examining and problematizing our reasons to give in to the therefore the linked state is true to the I submit constitutes the core of Foucault's genealogical project of a history of truth, while also opening up the space for the elaboration of an ethics and politics of truth-telling, which instead of conceding the existence of such a therefore, puts it at the forefront by shifting the attention towards the question of the speaker's ethos and the ethico-political effects of her truth-telling. In this light, the analysis I have offered of Parrhēsia as a speech act enables us, I hope, to rethink the role that truth-telling plays in our society and to newly define critique as a historically situated and foundationalist without foundation activity that incessantly attempts to change oneself, others, and the world. It also allows us to see that the force of truth, that is, its capacity to produce effects on reality, is necessarily contextual. Hence, the suggestion, as Foucault puts it, that the critical thinker's attitude should be, quote, demanding, prudent, experimental, for at every moment, step by step, one must compare what one is thinking and saying with what one is doing with what one is, end of quote. Critique does not only consist in unmasking and problematizing the received therefores that characterize contemporary regimes of truth, but also in creating and experimenting with new therefores of truth, and instead of concealing them, making them and their consequences as explicit as possible in our words, in our actions, and in our lives. I think that this is the kind of one of the most interesting, at least for me, legacies of Foucault's history of truth and of his analysis of Parrhēsia. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Lorenzini. Now we are ready to move to the Q&A session. First, I will address the audience if they have any questions. Does anybody have any question? Okay, then I will ask you a question. I had like a few of them. The first concerns like yesterday we had Kürünkov here presenting his genealogical project and contrasting it with Poe and Bernard Williams. And you as well engage with Williams' work in your book, but I think you like contrast your possibilizing genealogy and his vindicatory genealogy. But I think that there is, as very reminiscent taste between the division or differentiation between analytic games of truth and regime of truth, because Williams differentiates truth and truthfulness, and I think it looks the same almost, and so the question is, how would you articulate this difference between Williams and Foucault?
Great. That's a yeah.
Yeah, we hear you. We hear you.
Should I answer now or
Yeah.
Yeah. So no, this is a great question. I have, so with Colin Koopman, we're in constant his recent paper that might be the one that he presented there yesterday is one, you know, like we have some points of difference in the sense that I do think that, you know, his insistence on the importance of history in Foucault's genealogical method is good and is correct. But I do think that there's a very different way in which Williams and Foucault use history. But this might be for another time. Your question more specifically on whether the difference between games of truth and regimes of truth is the same as what Williams say in, you know, like in differentiating truth and truthfulness. So I think that there's a way in which the two distinctions can be mapped one onto the other, but Williams in the annex of truth and truthfulness does criticize ultimately the idea that truth itself can have a history, which I take to be probably the main difference between him and Foucault. I think Foucault has a minimalist conception of truth, so it does work with, you know, like a kind of you know, very basic understanding of truth in our practices. But I think that at every moment in which we try to actually define something like the concept of truth itself, for Foucault, it's impossible to do it without history. Whereas Williams seems to think that the concept of truth itself is also like immune to history, right? It's also, so it doesn't take explicitly Foucault as his target. It takes Marcel de Thiene, this historian of ancient Greece, who was a very important source for Foucault. So I always thought that the real target there was Foucault for Williams. And so I would say that this is probably the main difference that I see between the two. I think that Williams doesn't go as far as Foucault goes in historicizing the truth. And because games of truth for Foucault, you know, there are certain games of truth we could say that are very constant in human history and that might seem to be outside of history, but Foucault would never concede that any game of truth is outside of history, outside of a certain socio-political context, whereas Williams seems to think that that's the case. Does it make sense? Does it relate to the way in which you also read Williams?
Yeah, I was, I think, looking for something like that. And I have the second question. It concerns more the second part of your talk. In lectures, Discourse and Truth, in his footnotes, and I think it isn't in footnotes, it is in script of Foucault's lectures, he says that like there are 4 modalities of speech, or 4 positions. It is like a wise man, and a Parrhēsiast, a teacher, and a philosopher. And he says that the Enlightenment movement is trying to take all those four positions and speak from this position. But when he comes back to the Enlightenment in his comment on Was ist die Aufklärung of Kant, he never mentions Parrhēsia, and it isn't the problem for him there. And so this leads to question what if it is not a Socratic one, if it is a modern one. So have you ever engaged with that, or have you ever thought about that? And what's your thought on that? So thank you.
Great. So there are two places. It's lecture course at the Collège de France on the government of self and others, and it is at some point in one specific passage of Discourse and Truth that Foucault connects enlightenment and Parrhēsia in his own project, in saying, you know, like, my historical study or genealogical study of Parrhēsia is part of a genealogy of the critical attitude in our society, which of which Kant's text on the Aufklärung is also a part. So he does connect the two things. He doesn't say that Kant is talking about Parrhēsia there, but he says that Kant is taking on, in a different context, the same clusters of problems that Foucault takes himself to be addressing when he talks about ancient Parrhēsia. So I think that you're right in saying that there's a clear link there, and Foucault doesn't. So Foucault only mentioned this link twice and very rapidly without really going into it. So what does a modern form? How can Parrhēsia? So there are two ways of responding to this question, you know, like of the modern form of Parrhēsia. One way is a philological historical one. So there was a conference a few years ago in France that precisely retraced the history of the notion of Parrhēsia in Renaissance and modern times, and it's still something that is going on. You know, like, there are different ways in which especially novelists and poets, but also some philosophers inherit this notion, you know, like, and talk about this notion. Then there's, I think, a more interesting question that is the philosophical question of, can we do something with the notion of Parrhēsia today? And to this question, I would say, I don't think that the point of Foucault or the point of my book in talking about Parrhēsia is to say we have to reactivate the mode of telling the truth that Plato has against the tyrant, or that, you know, like, this other figure in antiquity has, because that would be a historical way of doing things, right? We are in a completely different context. But I think that the cluster of problems that the notion of Parrhēsia was at the center of at that time is in a way very similar to the problems that we have today. And to me, the main problem is, how do we think about the relationship between critique and truth in a context in which it is clear that in order for, you know, like, someone's words to count and to have power, their truth value is not absolutely necessary. So, like, you know, it's not necessary for Trump to tell the truth, or for Bolsonaro to try to tell the truth in order for them to convince people and to have power. And so for me, Parrhēsia is mostly a way for us to think about this problem and to think about, you know, the idea. So I think that was what is really important in Parrhēsia is that it is a way of speaking that puts at the forefront one's beliefs in a way that makes it very clear the kind of the link between the beliefs and the conduct or the consequences of those beliefs. And it is also a way of leaving the other, the interlocutor, entirely free in relation to these beliefs. And that's where I think there's a democratic value in this form of speaking, right? So it's not, the Parrhēsiast is not someone that tries to persuade others. He's someone that inserts a set of beliefs sort of claims in a political context, and leaves the others free to, you know, take them on or not. And that is, to me, a very interesting way of thinking about what critique is today. There are other parts of the book in which I connect this to also kind of more practical collective movements, but that will lead us afar, I think. But that's what I believe Parrhēsia, why I believe that thinking about this today is important.
Yeah, thank you. It is pretty clear. Thank you very much. So we have, I think, the last question from the audience, and then we will finish. So
thank you.
Okay, do you hear me? Okay, so after the thoughtful and well-informed questions by Nikita, I will ask the stupid one. You started with a statement that truth by itself does not lead to like us agreeing to it or us acting according to that. But I think that since like performative utterance or Parrhēsiastic utterance as well could be ineffective, meaning they do not lead to changes in the person. For example, like I could say to a tyrant that he is a tyrant and he will simply kill me. Or like my cry would go unnoticed and like everything will remain basically the same. So I think that this question, where does truth takes its force, remains. So like maybe I didn't understand your argument, or like could you say a little bit more about that? Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's a very important question, and it's absolutely central to what I was trying to do. So you're right in saying that I don't think that there's a way of, you know, ensuring the link between, especially if we are at the perlocutionary level, right? There's no way of ensuring the link between a certain utterance, especially in a political context, and its uptake by the interlocutor, by the audience. And that is, I mean, that is part of the problem for me, because it means that, you know, part of Foucault's argument is precisely to say, in order for truth-telling or for a certain statement to acquire force, we need to analyze it at a level that is not just the epistemic one. And one of my problems is, it seems like today the apologists of fact-checking, for instance, seem to completely forget that. Like, seems to think that, or there is a way in which I think we still tend to think that it's enough to show a fact, or that's enough to show something that is true from the epistemic level, to actually have that truth have a force in the political, social domain. And I just think that it's not the case. And more than that, it's actually dangerous to think that it's the case, because we, you know, fact-checking is interesting, but I don't think it leads to interesting or important results in practice. So, of course, what this opens is the question of what are the ways in which truth can be given a force in a certain specific context. And you're right in saying, you know, like in my talk, I didn't answer to the question, but I hope that I showed why that question makes sense. And there's a way. So if you know Linda Zerilli, she's a political theorist who works at the University of Chicago. She has a book coming out where she builds on my book. She combines it with Arendt, and she tries to give a response to this question. And so if you want, my aim here was a bit more modest, was to make the question available itself by showing that a certain way of thinking today about the relationship between truth and critique is an obstacle instead of something that can help us in order to understand this complex, complicated question. So there's still more work to do, in other terms, and you're right in pointing to that. I hope that at least the question becomes clearer using Foucault in the way in which I did in the book and my talk. Does it make sense?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I think we'll wrap it up here. Thank you very much, Professor Lorenzini. We hope to cooperate sometimes in the future. So thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Yeah, goodbye, goodbye. Слушатели, в Zoom у нас часовой перерыв, и потом